Hey, welcome to Wolf's Watch. How you doing today? Hope you're having a marvelous Monday. Today, I want to talk with you real briefly about constraints on scaling your business, but also on innovation. And innovation is very important to scaling your business. And we're going to talk about a lesson learned from the launch systems industry. SpaceX, I'm sure you heard of them. Uh, they've been going great guns, but they compete against a consortium led by Boeing and some other organizations. I have some experience from this industry, and that's why I want to share with you something that I learned from working on space system development. Now, hang on a second. I'm going to I want to look up something here for you. I've got some. What I want to talk with you about is you can see here. This is a picture of a Delta II rocket, Delta II launch system. This was something that's been flying since the 1960s, late 50s, 1960s, and it was the basis for developing Next Generation in the 1990s when I was at then McDonnell Douglas. It's now a unit of Boeing. And there are a couple of things that we learned in doing that. And it also is the key to why SpaceX has been able to get a foothold to compete against them and to be able to scale so quickly relative to the rest of the industry, right? Because we've been flying rockets for quite a while, especially since the end of World War II. So you're looking at a good 70-year run up to where SpaceX is at today. Now, something that we were doing, bear in mind, I need to look off camera here for a second. So bear with me. I want to pull up phenomenal chart that quickly summarizes what was happening in in the in the industry. And make sure we got the right one. No, we don't have that queued up. Okay, let me tell you. Part of our mission at that time, when I was involved with launch system development at SpaceX, not SpaceX. I'm sorry. A lot of my colleagues are at SpaceX. Would like to be part of that team. They got a lot going on. When I was at McDonnell Douglas, which is now part of Boeing, and getting something queued up here that'll help put a fine point on. The big issue was getting the cost per pound or cost per kilo of payload into orbit in a more affordable way. And this is what I want to show you. And I've got two charts. One I want to recommend that you go check out because it's just such a easy to read graphic from visualcapitalist.com. Just share this with you real quick. Now this gives you a quick summary of how the cost has shifted in the industry. Because you look here at what it cost to put payload into orbit in the 1960s was dramatically more expensive than it is today. And here's the impact that SpaceX has had over here. You see this? If you can see my cursor there, this is something that dramatically drove down the pricing, the cost, which was a huge consideration because we were trying to get payload costs down to $10,000 per pound. Really wanted to get it down to $1,000 per pound. But we had internal constraints to work with, some logical, some not logical. We want to talk about the business reality of being able to develop something as huge as a launch system. So think about this. You're talking things that are 20 to 60 feet in diameter, depending on the size of the launch system, or bigger, hundreds of feet tall, that are being launched into space, basically sitting on top of a controlled explosion. The technology for being able to control these, to be able to manufacture these, has changed dramatically. The involvement that I had with launch system development was looking at producibility issues, and also with working on how do we go about the development process in a way that gives us a better result and helps us move faster and minimize the cost without sacrificing the quality of the outcome. If you want to see why quality of outcome is important, I recommend that you search on the internet for the video of Delta II launch anomaly. 1997. And we watched this happen, and it was horrifying. It gives you a video of what happens when there's what the industry calls a launch anomaly. Roughly 7 to 13 seconds in not 13 seconds, more like 7 seconds. It was barely off the ground, especially for something that large, when an anomaly occurred. So what an anomaly is in that industry is the rocket blew up while it still had most of its fuel on board because it was just getting off the launch pad. Excuse me. If I remember right, that destroyed 3 communications trailers, damaged 300 cars in the parking lot. Fortunately, no people were injured. There was no loss of life, but there were craters in the parking lot afterwards. It's a great video to watch. It's just horrifying. We saw it. I didn't get to see it live, but I saw the replay shortly after it happened. And at that time, and we were all absolutely horrified. So we can't violate quality. I'm looking for another chart here that we're going to talk about on the cost. Certainly can't violate quality, but needed to get the cost down so that we could do more flights, so we can get more stuff up in orbit and make it more economical to be in space, right? Right. I don't know about you, but we do not want to stop pushing forward into space. A lot of technology gets developed. There are a lot of good things that come from that effort. There's a lot of technologies that we take for granted today that were developed for the original space launch, the original space race. Here is what I wanted to share with you. Let me get this queued up into a size that will work on the screen. Thanks for hanging with me. I know this is a little boring. Best of planning, right? Set this up, tested it out before we went live, still had a problem. So we are innovating on the fly. So here is some more detail. Now, this was brought to us by Aerospace compare cost for launch vehicle designs. And you can, I'll give you where you can find this in the notes. So I don't want to take more of your time, but some with this. So here's what it looks like. So here in the 1960s, we're looking at $200,000 per kilogram to get into orbit. In the 1990s, we got that down below 10,000. Now I mentioned the Delta launch system. So we had being able to work from an existing design like the Delta II, we were able to get, or McDonnell Douglas was able to get the Delta III flying fast. I'm sure some of my former colleagues might take me to task for saying we, but I'll tell you what, at the time, it was very much we. I was very proud of being part of that team. And instead of continuing with the team to work producibility as it went into production, I had an opportunity to go into consulting, which I'd always wanted to do. And you'll hear more about that. You've probably heard some if you've been following our broadcast for long. So with Delta III, we were able to, in a relatively short time, so we're talking 3 to 5 years, have a new design out that we could fly that dramatically lowered the cost, right? So here, let me find Delta III for you in this mess. So you can see here in the late 2000s, the cost is starting to drop. So these blue, where you see the blue dots, that is more Western U.S. allied flight. You got some China in here. We're looking for the right space vehicle. Well, let's start here. See where we've gotten to with the Falcon 9, which has been flying since 2010. So here's some important stats to consider. And you can see it here on this chart. I'm going to look over here and read, but as you can see this dot, we're circling, come back here. That's the SpaceX Falcon 9, which has gotten the cost down to $2,600 approximately. And this is estimated by aerospace.sys.org. And it's flown 76 times since 2010. That's a key number. 2 key numbers here. What's the cost? $2,600 per kilogram to get something up in the low orbit. The second is how much has it been flying and since when? So it's flown 76 times since 2010. Now, I mentioned Delta III, right? We worked on Delta III design. We were able to get it flying relatively quickly for that industry. Let me find the summary here. I know it's here. I was looking at it earlier. Atlas III. That's not what we're looking for. Delta III. So here are the Delta III. That's been flying since 1999. Delta 3 had 2 successful launches at approximately 140. So that got it down to 18,000. We did get under 20,000, but we didn't get anywhere near the 10,000. Delta 4, which is a bigger launch system, a bigger version of that helps with cost because there are multiple versions of it. There's a medium and what we call medium and a heavy. So to compare it to the Falcon 9 medium, we'll find the Delta 4 didn't get the cost down as low, and it hasn't been flying as much. It hasn't been as popular because of the cost, in part, and because there are problems with being able to keep it, the turnaround, the manufacturer, the ability to turn around and get it back in space. There's not as much reusability as SpaceX has been able to design into their systems. Well, this is turned into more of a train wreck than I wanted it to be. So that gives you just a sense of, from the 1960s, we're going from 200,000. Now Falcon 9 is really leading the industry with 2,600. Right. So think about that, from 1960, $200,000 per kilogram, 2010, right? 50 years later, it was down to 2,600. Here's where we ran into problems. This was the lesson that I wanted to share with you, and I thank you for sticking with me to get this. This is a long wind up to get to the point. The point here is what we ran into in constraints were twofold. We had the inertia of an organization that's been involved in space technologies and launch system technology since the 1950s. We took an existing design, so there's a lot of knowledge around that design. The inertia behind that was there were certain things that we could and could not do in terms of making a new design, where SpaceX had an advantage because SpaceX understood what these constraints were. And here's a key reason they were able to work around them. One of the things that we couldn't do was incorporate the latest design philosophies because of the cost of changes. And think about that for a second. We've got an existing design that's already flying. So our strategic advantage was, at that time, that team's strategic advantage on the Delta 3, Delta 4 design was being able to take an existing design, modify it in order to have a larger, more efficient flight system, launch system. Okay. There were some things that we could change and some things that we could not because of the cost of requalifying the system. So what does that mean? If you're not familiar with things that fly, you have to go through a very lengthy testing and approval process to have it qualified. Oh, if I can not smack my microphone here, they have it qualified in order to fly. Or in other words, that's where all of the appropriate safety, industry, and government organizations sign off and go, you know what? This is good to go. You can fly this, you can launch it. And we are highly confident that it is very unlikely that there's going to be a problem that will cause loss of life. You do not want a launch system or an aircraft coming down in a residential area, right? I don't want that to happen. That's part of the qualifications, to make sure stuff's not going to break when it's put under the stress of flight, of launch. Same's true for cars. Same's true for automobiles. Same's true for boats that go out in the water. They need to be designs need to be qualified. So if there is different levels of requalification. So if you're taking a design that's already been qualified and it's been in the field, that's been launching for a number of years, like a Delta 2, there are certain things that you can do in order to change that design that have a minimized requalification process. So it is much, much less expensive and it happens much faster. We needed to work within those constraints, which limited being able to make some changes that we knew would be not for safety purposes, but for cost purposes would give a superior product. We couldn't maintain the development cost and the development timeline. This is the other thing about qualification. It's a very lengthy process to have to take a new product and put it through the testing and qualification. Like, for example, in the aircraft industry, which I was also involved in, more lessons from that at another time. Typically, with a brand new airplane, there's 3 prototypes, minimum of 3, but there's 3 prototypes that are built so that 2 can be used for test flights and 1 can be used for destructive testing. Or in other words, they literally destroy the aircraft intentionally to find out what's the limits for the airframe for the aircraft. Where will it begin to fall apart? What type of stress does it take to make a wing come off? What do you got to do to rip a wing off in flight, for example, so that it is very likely not to happen, if that makes sense. So the same thing with requalifying hardware. And here's where SpaceX had a great advantage. SpaceX comes in, they're a brand new company. They have to qualify everything that they do. So they're starting from zero, which made it possible to do things that didn't make sense financially for companies that had existing hardware to fly. How does that apply to your business? Right? What changes? And yes, there were specific changes that was involved in that we couldn't do. That's not the point. The point is things that we could not justify financially and timeline wise for SpaceX or for McDonnell Douglas. SpaceX could do because they had to qualify the whole system anyway. So that allowed them to start with a completely clean sheet. They also knew this. They knew what these constraints were. They were able to recruit top talent from companies like McDonnell Douglas, Boeing now, from Boeing, from Lockheed, from the other companies that were involved in the launch system industry, Aerojet, which makes engines for the launch systems. That put them in a strategic advantage where you can say, look, here's the constraints our competitors have. We are not constrained by those because our cost model, our requirements for putting something up, for being able to launch a system are different. That they leverage those, even though it costs more, they leverage those for an advantage to have a product that is more manufacturable, that is more reusable, that costs dramatically less. Because coming back to this chart, so think about this. Think about where this put Falcon 9 in terms of the cost, right? Because the estimate is that Falcon 9 is about $2,600 per kilogram to get something into low Earth orbit. So satellite orbit, communications orbit, GPS, things of that nature. They're here, right? Let me come over here because I can, if I drag my cursor this way, thanks for hanging with me. So here's where they're at. Falcon 9, 2,600 kilograms. They're $2,600 per kilogram. We're right here. Well, look at where Atlas 5 is, for example, 8,100. Delta 4, yeah, I finally found it. So Delta 4 is at 10,400. We were looking to get below 10,000, made it to 10,400. Delta 4 has been flying since 2002. So the design, when I was involved in it, was 1999-ish. We were still doing development. So it was 7 years. There was more that was happening before I was involved with the program. 5-7 years, but still relatively fast for that industry to get it to fly. But since 2002, there's only been 31 launches, where SpaceX has done 76. Now, some of that's constraints on how fast a launch system can be from the time the customer makes an order for a launch, how to launch something in an orbit, how long it takes to put something on the launch pad to take that payload to orbit. And part of that is the fact that SpaceX has been able to leverage reuse and other producibility tactics that make it possible for them to field the next system, to get the next launch to happen much, much faster and at a radically cheap. So here we're talking 10,400. Falcon 9 is at 2,600. Where can you leverage those kind of constraints that your competitors have that you don't have from a market standpoint? There's two ways to look at this: market facing, and then we'll talk about operations. So market facing, where can you take advantage of constraints that your competitors have, especially bigger companies? Where are opportunities of big companies because they have a lot of internal requirements. In terms of adapting, unless they've got a Lockheed Skunk, which is, we're talking technology, a Lockheed Skunk Works type of an organization, which is famed for being able to move fast. Most of the time, if you got a big competitor, part of your advantage is you can move faster, right? You're more agile than they are. So where can you leverage those types of constraints that they have, both financially and in terms of market timing, in terms of getting information? Think about this. An advantage should be for you is speed with which you can get market feedback into and execute on that information. Think about that. How are you bringing that information in so that you can exploit weaknesses that your competitors have and be able to respond to the market, to your customers, to your prospective customers faster? Now, internally, there's another issue to consider. Internal constraints are rules, procedures, the legacy activities, roles and responsibilities, how companies are organized that create problems for them to be able to respond to market changes. This was something else that in large organizations, I had worked for several large organizations, and I've worked with companies from 14 people on the payroll to over 65,000 on the payroll. When you get above 500, you're starting to have problems with internal machinations. You got internal competition, you have internal roles and responsibilities, things that create problems that slow down an organization. There's more bureaucracy. Part of that is needed. Part of that just becomes whatever it is. It's something interesting that I learned from the then CEO of CalFed Bank in the 1980s. He came and spoke to our MBA class, and he talked about how, now imagine this is a bank, talked about how every 5 years they required every member of management in the organization to draw out a flow chart of every single activity that their department did and had to justify why they were doing that. And that was how they made sure that they stayed on point with customers, things that are directly related to customer service and profitability, and also to clean out the deadwood of bureaucratic procedures that build up over time, things that were no longer applicable, things that were put in place for work around to a problem that has since been solved. A lot of times, proper leverage of technology is an issue with this, but the technology can't be used properly, particularly software systems, because existing procedures aren't geared to allow what can be done in the electronic space, or it's just a crappy process. This is the most common thing. It's just a crappy process that doesn't work that well, and it becomes electronic, and all you do is fail faster because now you're moving at the speed of electronic communication. This comes back to the point of what constraints do you have within your company that are like that, which prevent you from being able to exploit opportunities to be able to do what you need to do. Where you've got organizations arguing, departments arguing over, oh, no, this is our responsibility. You can't do that. Right. In a large organization, we had a multi-million-dollar problem that had a very simple solution that would take a week off the critical path of the build for an aircraft. Think about that. What is the cost of a manufacturing day? What is the fixed cost for a day in a manufacturing organization for building a commercial airliner? Yeah, you're right. It's very, very expensive. We could take a week off of the critical path, which means 7 less days of fixed cost expense going into the overall cost of building the aircraft, plus getting it into the customer's hands a week faster. But the primary problem with taking action on the information was an argument between departments. So who was responsible for what? Where do you have, and you may not think you do, but where do you have issues like that within your team, even if it's as small as a team of 20? Where are things that you were doing 5 years ago that became habit or formal policy and procedure? The harder one to catch is habit, right? Because there's the formal policy and procedure, and then there's the informal that make things run. We took the informal tooling off of the production line for a commercial, for an aircraft, and then found that we couldn't assemble it because there were so many workarounds, things that because it took so long to review and solve problems, that people made little hand tools to help them make adjustments to get things to fit right in order to rivet things together. Where do you have informal things like that have now become a block to being able to innovate, a block to being able to scale because it's requiring more complicated, more labor-intensive things to be done that make it hard, if not impossible, to do more, to scale, right? To do more with the same people, to improve your productivity without adding staff. So just a couple quick thoughts on that. What are your external? What are market constraints or competitors what are constraints your competitors have in the marketplace? What are constraints your competitors have that you can exploit because you're smaller, more nimble, don't have a constraint on you, like publicly traded companies have constraints on what they can do. Being a privately owned firm, you can do things that allow you to move faster, allow you to have more variability in expense and revenue than publicly traded companies have, because it throws their stock value out of whack. Like, for example, when I was working with publicly traded companies, typically we could only do things that impacted revenue and profitability in increments of about 3%. Why is that? A big part of that is it affects their stock market value. You do something, hey, you know what, we're going to, on this production line in 6 months, increase productivity by 50%. That creates stock market expectations. If you don't do that again the following, then that kind of variability creates problems with the business press, with investors, with Wall Street expectations, which you don't have. Another reason I don't work with publicly traded companies anymore. Got to move too slow. It's all about serving the customer. It's all about building the culture that you want. Very few publicly traded companies are willing to get out of serving the quarterly reports to the business press and to the investors in order to maximize the revenue by better serving their customers, right? So, long way around the bend for 2 points. Exploit the constraints your competitors have. Second, get rid of the constraints you've got internally, because what you did 5 years ago, especially with the pandemic, that's been a big example. What you did 5 years ago, probably not working so well now, regardless of whether or not you scale, just because the economic environment's changed. As you scale your company, you're going to find what worked when you were in startup mode, making that first, getting that up to that first million in revenue and holding that is not going to work when you're going from 5 or 10 million in revenue to 50 or 100. So I'd love to hear your comments. Thanks for being part of Wolf's Watch. If you would, hit the like button, throw your comments in. Always love responding to to your comments and continuing the conversation. This is 21st Century TV, right? Live and interactive. So thanks for being part of Wolf's Watch, and I will see you on the trail.